Everyone thought Judge Reynolds was untouchable, until one case changed everything. A man fighting for justice walked out of his courtroom with nothing, but just 9 minutes later, the judge's entire career began to unravel. What happened that day exposed more than anyone could have imagined. Before we start the story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension as people settled into their seats, the soft rustling of papers and occasional whispers breaking the silence. At the front, Judge Thomas Reynolds sat with a stiff posture, his face unreadable as he scanned through documents in front of him. He was known for his stern demeanor, but behind his reputation as a firm judge, there were murmurs, stories of rulings that didn't quite sit right, decisions that seemed more personal than professional. James Carter, a well-dressed man in his late 30s, sat at the defendant's table. He exuded a calm confidence, though his eyes betrayed a hint of weariness. This wasn't his first battle in court, but it was perhaps his most important. James was fighting to protect a small piece of property that had been in his family for decades. His attorney, Sarah Mitchell, a sharp and relentless advocate, sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly around a stack of neatly organized files. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and had no intention of letting it slip away. As the proceedings began, Sarah presented their case with precision. She walked the court through a timeline of events, submitting photographs, legal documents, and even witness statements that painted a clear picture of James's rightful ownership. But as she spoke, Judge Reynolds seemed distracted. His gaze wandered, his fingers tapping idly against the desk. When Sarah introduced a critical piece of evidence, a signed affidavit from a longtime neighbor, Judge Reynolds cut her off mid-sentence. "That won't be necessary," he said, his tone clipped and final. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Sarah hesitated, confused. "Your Honor, this document directly supports my client's claim," she began, but Judge Reynolds waved a dismissive hand. "We've heard enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Let's move to a ruling." The decision came faster than anyone expected. In less than 5 minutes, the judge sided with the opposing party, dismissing James's claim without acknowledging much of the evidence. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Sarah clenched her jaw, her frustration evident. James, however, remained calm. He simply stood, nodded to Sarah, and began to gather his papers. As James left the courtroom, the gallery buzzed with quiet outrage. A man sitting near the back whispered to his companion, "That was over before it started." Others exchanged looks of disapproval, but no one spoke up. Judge Reynolds maintained his air of indifference, tapping his gavel to restore order before calling for the next case. But something hung in the air, a tension that even the judge couldn't shake, though he did his best to ignore it. Sarah, however, wasn't ready to let it go. As James exited through the heavy wooden doors, she stayed behind, her fingers flying across her phone screen. She sent a message to an unknown contact, her face hard with determination. Whatever she was planning, it was clear she wasn't going to let this ruling stand without a fight. Judge Reynolds returned to his chambers after the swift dismissal of James Carter's case. The gavel he had used moments earlier now sat idly on his desk, its echo still ringing faintly in his mind. He loosened his tie, brushing off the faint unease that had crept over him. This was just another case, he told himself. Nothing unusual. Yet something about Sarah Mitchell's sharp glare as she left the courtroom lingered. Minutes passed uneventfully. He reached for his coffee, now cold, and leaned back in his chair. Then his desk phone buzzed, a sharp, unexpected sound that made him sit up straighter. Reynolds rarely received calls during court hours unless it was urgent. He cleared his throat and picked up the receiver. "This is Reynolds," he said, his tone brisk. On the other end, a voice introduced itself calmly but firmly as someone from the State Judicial Review Board. Judge Reynolds stiffened, his fingers tightening around the phone. The caller informed him that a complaint had just been filed, triggering an immediate inquiry into his handling of the case he had just dismissed. Reynolds frowned, irritation mixing with a twinge of anxiety. "What complaint?" he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. This was a routine ruling. The voice on the line didn't waver. The complaint alleges judicial bias. It's supported by several documented cases where similar patterns were observed. "We're calling to inform you that an independent review has been authorized, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Judge Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. He couldn't remember the last time anyone from the Judicial Board had acted this quickly. It was unsettling. Without another word, the line went dead, leaving Reynolds staring at the phone as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Back in the courthouse hallway, Sarah Mitchell walked briskly alongside James Carter, her phone still in hand. She had sent multiple messages in the past few minutes, contacting key individuals who could bring attention to what had just happened. She glanced at James, who seemed far calmer than she felt. "They won't get away with this," she said firmly. "That ruling wasn't just unfair, it was deliberate, and I'll make sure it doesn't stand." James nodded but said little. He trusted Sarah's determination, though his mind was already racing ahead. Something about the judge's demeanor during the case hadn't sat right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time Reynolds had made a decision like this. As they stepped into the crisp afternoon air, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. "It's already starting," she muttered. Without explaining further, she motioned for James to follow her. Whatever she had put in motion was moving faster than either of them had anticipated. Judge Reynolds paced his chambers, the caller's words looping in his mind. He had dealt with complaints before, irritated lawyers or disgruntled parties upset about losing a case. But this felt different. It wasn't the complaint itself that unnerved him, but the speed at which the board had moved. 9 minutes. That was all it had taken for them to act. Reynolds knew the board rarely intervened without strong evidence, and he couldn't ignore the chilling implications. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, his hand trembling slightly. The call went to voicemail. Cursing under his breath, he ended the call and slumped into his chair. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt the weight of his authority slipping from his grasp. His confidence, which had always been his shield, was now riddled with cracks. Meanwhile, Sarah and James walked toward the courthouse steps, joined by a small group of reporters who had already caught wind of the dismissal. Sarah, ever the professional, declined to comment, but held her head high. James followed suit, his composure unbroken, though the growing crowd made him uneasy. As they stepped away from the media, Sarah's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. "The footage is circulating," she said quietly, tilting the screen to show James a short clip. It was a recording of Judge Reynolds' ruling, uploaded by someone in the gallery. The dismissive tone in Reynolds' voice and his refusal to consider evidence were already sparking outrage online. "It's going viral," Sarah continued. "People are tagging the Judicial Board and demanding answers. This isn't just a legal fight anymore. It's public now." James watched the video in silence. For the first time, he noticed how the narrative had shifted. He was no longer just a man fighting a property dispute. He had become a symbol of something much larger. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but steady. "What happens next?" Sarah's expression was determined, almost fierce. "Now," she said, "we make sure they can't ignore this." Back in the courthouse, Reynolds' unease deepened as a second call came through, this time from a colleague on the bench. The tone was curt, almost dismissive. "Thomas, there's chatter about your ruling today. It's not looking good. You should prepare for a formal inquiry." Reynolds barely replied before the line went dead. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. What he had thought was a routine decision was rapidly spiraling into something far more dangerous. And for the first time, he realized this was no longer in his control. Judge Reynolds' discomfort shifted to full-blown panic as his office door swung open, revealing the court administrator. A composed but stern woman, she entered without invitation, clutching a folder in her hand. Her expression was unreadable, but her brisk steps and clipped tone left no room for pleasantries. "Judge Reynolds, we need to talk," she said, setting the folder on his desk. This just came from the Judicial Review Board. Reynolds hesitated before picking up the folder. Inside was an official notice stating that an immediate review of his recent rulings was underway. Starting with the Carter case, he skimmed the page, his mouth going dry as he read phrases like pattern of judicial impropriety and failure to uphold impartiality. "This is absurd," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "One case doesn't justify this kind of reaction." The administrator's gaze was sharp. "This isn't about one case. This is about a history that's catching up with you. The Carter case was just the tipping point." Reynolds' indignation faltered. He had always believed his position made him untouchable, his authority unquestionable. But now, the walls were closing in, and he was starting to see how far this might go. Outside the courthouse, Sarah sat on a bench with James, her phone buzzing non-stop with notifications. The video of the judge's ruling had reached thousands, with comments pouring in by the second. People shared their own stories of judicial misconduct, amplifying the backlash. A few prominent voices had picked up the clip, calling for Reynolds' immediate suspension. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you think this will be enough?" he asked. "It's not just about Reynolds anymore," Sarah replied, scrolling through her phone. "This has turned into something bigger. People aren't just angry about your case, they're angry about what he represents." James nodded, understanding her point but still unsure of what the outcome would be. He glanced back at the courthouse, his thoughts racing. For years, he had felt like the system wasn't built for people like him, people without connections, without privilege. Now, for the first time, he felt the system cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. As Sarah scanned her phone, a new notification caught her attention. She tapped on the message, her lips curving into a faint smile. "The review board just released a statement," she said, turning the screen toward James. The statement was brief but firm. "We take allegations of judicial misconduct seriously and have launched an immediate investigation into Judge Thomas Reynolds. Updates will follow." James read the words carefully, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sat back, exhaling slowly. Looks like the judge isn't as untouchable as he thought. Inside his chambers, Reynolds sat alone, staring at the folder on his desk. The once confident judge now looked smaller, his authority unraveling with each passing minute. Somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't going to end with a simple inquiry. This time, there would be consequences. The courthouse was unusually quiet that afternoon, though the tension in Judge Reynolds' chambers was suffocating. The walls, once adorned with certificates and commendations, seemed to close in on him. His phone buzzed again, a call from the Chief Justice of the State Judiciary. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but the weight of the situation forced his hand. "Reynolds," he said, attempting to sound composed. The Chief Justice didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thomas, what's going on? I've been fielding calls all morning. This case is a disaster. Do you realize what's happening?" Reynolds opened his mouth to respond, but the chief cut him off. "This isn't just public backlash. The board is involved, and it's moving fast. They're demanding your immediate suspension pending a full investigation." Reynolds' stomach twisted. "Suspension?" he repeated, his voice thin. "I've handled hundreds of cases without issue. One ruling shouldn't." "It's not one ruling," the chief interrupted. "This is about perception, Thomas, and right now the perception is that you're biased. Public trust in the judiciary is at stake. Do you understand what that means?" The line went silent for a moment. Reynolds closed his eyes, gripping the edge of his desk as the chief continued. "You need to step aside. The board will be issuing their statement soon. I suggest you prepare yourself." The call ended abruptly, leaving Reynolds staring at the blank wall in front of him. For years he had operated with the belief that his position was immune to scrutiny. Now, that illusion was crumbling. Outside the courthouse, Sarah and James were approached by a group of reporters, cameras clicking and microphones thrust toward them. Sarah, composed and professional, offered a short statement. The dismissal of this case was not only unjust, but indicative of a deeper issue within the judiciary. We welcome the review board's investigation and hope this serves as a step toward restoring faith in the system. James stood silently beside her, his presence calm but commanding. The reporter's questions came rapidly. Do you think the judge is guilty of bias? Will you be refiling the case? How far are you willing to take this? Sarah answered carefully but firmly. Our focus is on ensuring accountability. This isn't just about one case. It's about ensuring fairness for everyone who comes through those courtroom doors. As the reporters dispersed, James turned to Sarah, his expression thoughtful. Do you think this will actually change anything? Sarah hesitated for a moment before replying. It already has, but we're not done yet. Back in his chambers, Reynolds received another notification. This time, it was an official email from the Judicial Review Board confirming his suspension. He read the words slowly, his hands trembling. Effective immediately, Judge Thomas Reynolds is suspended from all judicial duties pending further investigation. The gavel that had symbolized his authority now seemed more like a weight he couldn't lift. For the first time, Reynolds felt the sharp sting of accountability, and it cut deeper than he had ever imagined. Judge Reynolds sat frozen in his chair, the email glaring back at him from his laptop screen. His suspension, swift and decisive, felt like a punch to the gut. He had spent decades building his career, climbing the ranks, and earning what he believed was an unshakable reputation. Now, it was slipping through his fingers in the time it took to read a few sentences. He stood abruptly, pacing his chambers. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything to make sense of what was happening. But the truth was unavoidable. This wasn't about one decision. It wasn't even about James Carter. The speed of the suspension made it clear that his past rulings were coming back to haunt him. Cases he thought had been forgotten were likely under review, and he knew what they would find. Patterns, assumptions, decisions that had always favored the powerful over the powerless. He slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the empty room. His thoughts drifted back to the Carter case. It was supposed to be routine. Dismiss the claim, side with the well-connected plaintiff, and move on. He hadn't expected Sarah Mitchell to be so relentless or for James Carter to remain so composed, and he certainly hadn't anticipated the video. The video. It was the one thing he couldn't control, and it was spreading like wildfire, fueling outrage with every view. Outside the courthouse, Sarah and James sat at a nearby cafe, trying to make sense of the whirlwind events. Sarah scrolled through her phone, monitoring the growing momentum online. The video had reached tens of thousands of views in just a few hours, with hashtags like #JudicialBias and #accountability for Reynolds trending on social media. Prominent figures had begun sharing the clip, calling for reform and transparency in the judicial system. Look at this, Sarah said, showing her phone to James. People are already connecting this to other rulings he's made. There are posts from people claiming similar treatment in his courtroom. James leaned closer, scanning the comments. Stories poured in from others who had been dismissed or unfairly judged by Reynolds. Land disputes, small business cases, even family court matters. There was a clear pattern emerging, and it wasn't in the judge's favor. It's not just me, James said quietly, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and sadness. This is bigger than my case. Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. Exactly. That's why this is gaining so much traction. Your case opened the floodgates, but it's exposing something systemic. Reynolds isn't just a bad judge. He's a symptom of a broken system. As they spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was an email from the Judicial Review Board, confirming that Reynolds' suspension had been made public. Attached was a formal statement outlining the reasons for the investigation, citing multiple allegations of impropriety, bias, and failure to uphold judicial standards. Sarah skimmed the email, then handed the phone to James. They're not holding back, she said. They've named your case specifically. This isn't just a slap on the wrist. They're preparing for something much bigger. James read the statement carefully, his brow furrowing. Do you think he'll fight this? He might try, Sarah replied. But the evidence is piling up. Between the public outcry and the formal complaints, he doesn't have much ground to stand on. Even if he tries to defend himself, the board won't let him off easily. Across town, Reynolds was discovering just how little support he had left. Calls to colleagues went unanswered, and his attempts to reach out to the Chief Justice again were met with curt responses. It became clear that no one wanted to be associated with him, not when his reputation was unraveling so publicly. Desperate for some kind of damage control, Reynolds called his attorney, a man who had represented high-profile clients in the past. The conversation was brief and tense. "I need you to handle this," Reynolds said, his voice sharp. "The board suspension is temporary. We can argue procedural errors, lack of evidence." His attorney cut him off. "Thomas, this isn't just about the suspension. The public pressure is overwhelming. You've got a video that paints you in the worst possible light, and now there's a full-scale review of your cases. This isn't a legal problem. It's a reputation problem, and it's a losing battle." Reynolds clenched his jaw. "So what are you saying? I should just roll over and let them ruin me?" "I'm saying you need to consider your options carefully," the attorney replied. "If this goes to a disciplinary hearing, everything you've ever done on the bench will be scrutinized. Every decision, every case, and if they find even one instance of misconduct that they can prove." He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Reynolds hung up without another word, the realization sinking in. He wasn't just at risk of losing his position. His entire career was in jeopardy. His authority, his reputation, his legacy. All of it could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, Sarah and James continued strategizing. Sarah had already begun drafting a motion to have James's case reopened, citing judicial bias and procedural misconduct. She was also working with other attorneys who had come forward with similar stories about Reynolds. The momentum was building, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like real change was within reach. As the sun set over the courthouse, the battle lines were drawn. On one side was Judge Reynolds, a man desperate to hold on to his crumbling authority. On the other were James, Sarah, and countless others who had been wronged, armed with evidence, public support, and an unwavering sense of justice. The fight wasn't over, but the tide was beginning to turn. The morning after his suspension, Judge Reynolds woke to a barrage of emails, text messages, and missed calls. The Judicial Review Board had made their decision public overnight, and the media storm had grown exponentially. News outlets were now running segments dissecting his rulings, pulling up old cases that painted a damning picture of his tenure. Headlines like, "Judge under fire for alleged bias," and "Decades of disparity, a closer." "Look at Reynolds' record," flashed across every screen. Reynolds rubbed his temples as he scrolled through his phone. His inbox was flooded with messages from angry strangers, former colleagues distancing themselves, and a few reporters seeking comments. His reputation was being shredded in real time, and there was little he could do to stop it. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt powerless, a stark reversal of the control he had wielded so effortlessly from the bench. Meanwhile, Sarah and James were already at work. Sarah's office was buzzing with activity, her desk buried under stacks of files, her phone lighting up every few minutes. Lawyers from across the state had reached out, offering evidence from cases they believed had been mishandled by Reynolds. A pattern was emerging. Reynolds often ruled in favor of powerful individuals or corporations, dismissing claims from plaintiffs who lacked the same influence. Land disputes, wrongful termination cases, small business conflicts. Reynolds had consistently sided with those who could afford to fight harder. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said, flipping through a file. Reynolds wasn't just biased, he was deliberate. He knew exactly what he was doing. James sat across from her, his arms crossed as he listened. "How does something like this go on for so long?" he asked. "Didn't anyone notice?" "They noticed," Sarah replied. "They just didn't care. Judges like Reynolds thrive because the system lets them. Most people don't have the resources to fight back, and those who do usually settle to avoid the cost and time. But this time, he pushed too far." As they spoke, Sarah received a call from one of the senior members of the Judicial Review Board. She put the phone on speaker, signaling for James to listen in. Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to inform you that the review board is moving quickly. The evidence you provided, combined with the public response, has created a strong case for immediate disciplinary action. We'll be holding a hearing next week. Sarah exchanged a look with James, her lips tightening. Thank you for the update. Will Mr. Carter's case be included in the hearing? Yes, the voice replied. We've flagged it as a critical example of bias. The board will also be examining his broader record to identify any systemic issues. After the call ended, James leaned forward, his voice steady but resolute. So, what happens if they find what we already know? Sarah looked at him, her expression serious. If the board confirms misconduct, Reynolds could be permanently removed from the bench. And if the findings are severe enough, there's a chance he could face legal consequences. James nodded, the weight of the situation settling over him. He's not going to go down quietly, he said after a moment. People like him never do. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes sharp. That's why we're not giving him a choice. Across town, Reynolds was scrambling to mount a defense. His attorney had called an emergency meeting, advising him to prepare for the worst. The review board is ruthless when it comes to cases like this, the attorney said, pacing the room. Once the public is involved, they don't stop until they've made an example out of someone. Right now, you're that someone. Reynolds frowned, his jaw tightening. So, what do you suggest? That I roll over and let them ruin me? I suggest you step aside voluntarily, the attorney replied, his tone blunt. Resigning might be your only way to salvage what's left of your reputation. Reynolds bristled at the idea. Resigning would mean admitting defeat, and he wasn't ready to give up that easily. But as the attorney continued to outline the potential outcomes of the hearing, a public reprimand, disbarment, and even lawsuits, Reynolds began to realize just how dire his situation was. Back at Sarah's office, the momentum continued to build. Reports from journalists and statements from advocacy groups flooded in, all echoing the same demand. Accountability. The movement had grown beyond James Carter's case, evolving into a broader push for judicial reform. People who had once felt powerless were now speaking out, their voices amplified by the media and social platforms. James watched it all unfold with a mix of pride and disbelief. I never thought this would happen, he admitted. I just wanted a fair hearing, and now, it's so much more. That's because fairness isn't just about your case, Sarah said. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. By the end of the day, Reynolds' name was everywhere, tied to allegations that grew more damning by the hour. His suspension had turned into a public spectacle, and the upcoming hearing promised to be even more explosive. But for Sarah and James, the fight wasn't over yet. They knew this was their chance to not only hold Reynolds accountable, but to set a precedent for change. And they weren't about to let it slip away. The week leading up to Judge Reynolds' disciplinary hearing was a whirlwind of activity. The media storm showed no signs of slowing down, with news outlets publishing detailed exposés on his past rulings. Each day seemed to bring new allegations, new voices stepping forward to share their stories of unfair treatment in Reynolds' courtroom. What had started with James Carter's case had turned into a full-blown movement. In Sarah's office, the pressure was mounting. She had spent hours preparing the motion to reopen James's case and drafting statements for the hearing. Her desk was piled high with affidavits and evidence, much of it sent by people who had experienced similar outcomes under Reynolds' watch. Each document painted a clearer picture of a judge who had abused his authority for years, dismissing cases that didn't align with his biases or personal interests. James sat across from her, going through one of the files she had handed him. It's the same story over and over, he said, shaking his head. Dismissed without cause, evidence ignored. It's like he didn't even try to hide it. He didn't think he had to, Sarah replied. Judges like Reynolds rely on the fact that most people don't have the resources to fight back. They assume their power is untouchable. James frowned. Do Do you think the board will really take this seriously, or will they just slap him on the wrist and move on? Sarah set down her pen and looked at him directly. The board has no choice but to take this seriously. The public isn't letting this go, and the evidence is too overwhelming to ignore. But we can't assume anything. We need to make sure there's no room for doubt. Outside, the movement against Reynolds was gaining traction. Social media was flooded with posts calling for his removal, with hashtags like #RemoveReynolds and #JudicialReform trending nationwide. Advocacy groups joined the chorus, demanding greater accountability within the judiciary and pushing for reforms that would make it harder for judges like Reynolds to operate unchecked. One particularly damning story came from a woman named Angela Morris, who had lost a custody battle in Reynolds' court, despite overwhelming evidence in her favor. Her tearful interview went viral, highlighting not only Reynolds' bias, but also the devastating impact his rulings had on real people's lives. "I don't know how someone like him could sit on the bench for so long," Angela said in the video. "He didn't care about justice. He cared about keeping people like me in their place." The video struck a chord, becoming a rallying cry for those who had felt silenced or ignored by the system. Even politicians began weighing in, calling for legislative action to address systemic issues in the judiciary. Reynolds' name became a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and the scrutiny extended far beyond him. Meanwhile, Reynolds was retreating further into isolation. His once loyal colleagues had turned their backs on him, and his attorney's advice to resign was beginning to feel like his only viable option. But the idea of stepping down filled him with anger and bitterness. He had spent decades building his career, making decisions he believed were right. Now he felt like a scapegoat, a man being torn down by public opinion. Sitting alone in his study, Reynolds poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared at the stack of legal documents his attorney had left for him. Each one detailed the allegations against him, including specific examples of bias and misconduct. It was hard to deny the pattern, even for him. The evidence was damning, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the news articles that had been written about him. One headline caught his eye: "Justice Under Fire, The Rise and Fall of Thomas Reynolds." The accompanying article dissected his career, highlighting moments that now seemed impossible to defend. His rulings, once considered firm and decisive, were now being re-examined in a harsh new light. For the first time, Reynolds began to wonder if he had misjudged more than just James Carter's case. The night before the hearing, Sarah sat in her office, going over her notes one last time. James was there, quiet but supportive as she prepared her arguments. "Tomorrow is the beginning of the end for Reynolds," she said, breaking the silence. "But it's also the beginning of something bigger. If we do this right, we can push for real change." James nodded. "You've already done more than I thought was possible. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've made people pay attention." Sarah smiled faintly, but her focus remained sharp. "We're not done yet. Tomorrow we make sure he answers for everything." The following morning, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, activists, and onlookers, all waiting for the hearing to begin. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No more bias." The energy was electric, a mix of outrage and hope. Inside the hearing room, Reynolds sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his attorney. His face was pale, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Across the room, the review board members took their seats, their expressions stern and focused. Sarah and James entered moments later, their presence drawing a wave of murmurs from the gallery. The board chair cleared her throat, silencing the room. "We are here to address allegations of judicial misconduct against Judge Thomas Reynolds," she began. "This hearing will examine evidence of bias, impropriety, and failure to uphold the principles of justice." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the hearing began. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. And as Sarah prepared to present her case, it became clear that the fight for justice had only just begun. The hearing room buzzed with tension as the proceedings began. The panel of review board members sat elevated at the front, their expressions hard and focused. Each member had a thick file in front of them containing the evidence compiled against Judge Reynolds. The chairperson, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of judicial experience, opened the proceedings with a statement that silenced the room. The purpose of this hearing, she began, is to determine whether Judge Thomas Reynolds has consistently violated the principles of impartiality and fairness required by his position. The allegations before us are not isolated incidents. They speak to a potential pattern of behavior that, if substantiated, represents a grave abuse of judicial authority. Reynolds sat stiffly at the defense table, his attorney beside him. His usual air of authority had given way to visible discomfort, his jaw tight and his fingers clenched around a pen. Across the room, Sarah sat next to James, her demeanor calm but focused. In front of her was a meticulously organized binder containing every piece of evidence she and her team had compiled. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. The first to testify was Angela Morris, the woman whose viral interview had brought national attention to Reynolds' alleged misconduct. She took the stand with quiet determination, recounting her custody battle in Reynolds' courtroom. Her voice shook slightly as she described how he had dismissed key evidence and interrupted her attorney repeatedly, favoring her ex-husband, a wealthy businessman with ties to local politicians. "I felt powerless," Angela said, her voice breaking. "No matter what we said, it felt like Judge Reynolds had already made up his mind. He didn't care about the facts. He didn't care about my children." As she spoke, Reynolds avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The board members listened intently, their faces grim. When Angela finished, she stepped down to a ripple of murmurs from the audience. Her testimony had struck a chord, setting the tone for the hearing. Next came Sarah's turn to present evidence. She stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the panel. She began with James's case, walking the board through the events of that day in painstaking detail. She showed the video footage of Reynolds dismissing James's claim, the judge's voice curt and dismissive as he cut off Sarah's arguments. The clip played on a large screen, filling the room with an uncomfortable silence. "This video," Sarah said, gesturing to the screen, "isn't just an example of judicial misconduct. It's a window into a larger pattern, a pattern that spans years and countless rulings." She handed the board members a series of documents, detailing cases where Reynolds had similarly dismissed evidence, rushed rulings, or sided with powerful plaintiffs. "These cases aren't isolated," she continued. "They show a clear bias in favor of those with influence and resources, often at the expense of individuals like Mr. Carter Reynolds' attorney objected, claiming that the cases were being taken out of context. But Sarah didn't flinch. She countered with more evidence, transcripts, affidavits, and testimonies from other attorneys who had witnessed Reynolds' behavior firsthand. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, and the board members exchanged glances as they sifted through the files. When Sarah finished, she returned to her seat next to James, who leaned over and whispered, "You were incredible." She gave him a small nod, her eyes still focused on the board. The turning point came when the board allowed Reynolds to testify. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie before approaching the stand. His once confident stride was replaced with hesitation, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I've served as a judge for over 20 years, he began. "I've always acted in what I believe to be the best interest of justice. If mistakes were made, they were unintentional." The room remained silent as Reynolds continued, attempting to defend his rulings as matters of legal interpretation. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence presented by Sarah and others. The board members pressed him with pointed questions. "Judge Reynolds," one member said, "can you explain why you dismissed Mr. Carter's case without allowing his attorney to present all her evidence?" Reynolds hesitated, his mouth opening and closing before he finally replied, "I believe the evidence was redundant." "And yet," the member continued, "you allowed the opposing party to present similar evidence without interruption. How do you justify that inconsistency?" Reynolds had no answer. His attorney attempted to intervene, but the damage was done. The panel's expressions grew colder, their questions sharper as they exposed flaw after flaw in Reynolds' testimony. By the end of the day, Reynolds looked defeated. His attorney sat beside him, whispering furiously, but Reynolds barely responded. The momentum of the hearing had shifted entirely in favor of the board and those seeking accountability. As the panel recessed for deliberations, Sarah and James stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Sarah answered questions carefully, her tone measured. "This isn't about one case," she said firmly. "It's about ensuring that every person who enters a courtroom is treated fairly, regardless of their background or resources. Judge Reynolds' actions have shown us what happens when accountability is absent. Today we're taking the first steps toward correcting that." James stood silently beside her, his presence a quiet but powerful statement. The reporters eventually dispersed, leaving the two of them alone. "What do you think they'll decide?" James asked, his voice low. Sarah glanced back at the courthouse, her expression unreadable. "They can't ignore the evidence. Whatever happens, Reynolds' career as a judge is over." Inside the courthouse, Reynolds sat alone, staring at the empty panel seats in front of him. His attorney had stepped out to make a call, leaving him to grapple with the reality of his situation. The once unshakable judge now felt like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff, waiting for the final push. And he knew it was coming. The air in the hearing room was thick with tension when the review board reconvened. Judge Reynolds had returned to his seat, but the confident posture he once carried had all but disappeared. His attorney sat beside him, flipping through documents, though the effort now seemed futile. The gallery was packed with onlookers, from journalists to former plaintiffs who had waited years for this moment. Among them sat James Carter, his gaze steady, while Sarah Mitchell kept her binder open, pen poised as if she were still preparing for battle. The chairperson called the hearing back to order, her voice calm but firm. "The board has reviewed the evidence and testimony presented over the past 2 days," she began. "Our findings are based on thorough examination and careful deliberation. This is not a decision we take lightly." A hush fell over the room as she continued. "Judge Thomas Reynolds, the evidence demonstrates a consistent pattern of bias and impropriety in your rulings. These actions have undermined the principles of impartiality and fairness, eroding public trust in the judiciary. As such, the board has unanimously decided to recommend your immediate removal from the bench." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief and satisfaction. Reynolds sat motionless, his face pale, as though the weight of the verdict had physically struck him. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but Reynolds didn't respond. He simply stared ahead, unblinking, as if willing himself to wake up from a nightmare. The chairperson wasn't finished. "In addition to your removal, the board will forward its findings to the State Attorney General's office for further investigation. This includes potential violations of judicial ethics and, if warranted, criminal charges." The gallery erupted, the low buzz escalating into a cacophony of whispers and exclamations. Reporters furiously scribbled notes while cameras captured every detail of Reynolds' stoic, yet visibly shaken demeanor. Sarah exchanged a look with James, her expression unreadable. James simply nodded, the smallest sign of relief crossing his features. As the hearing adjourned, Reynolds stood slowly, his legs unsteady. His attorney tried to shield him from the barrage of questions that began as soon as the doors opened, but the once dignified judge looked like a man unraveling. He moved through the crowd without a word, ignoring the cameras and pointed questions that followed him. Outside the courthouse, the energy was palpable. Activists held signs demanding broader judicial reform, their voices loud and determined. Reporters swarmed Sarah and James the moment they stepped outside, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Sarah, ever composed, addressed them with confidence. "Today's decision is a step toward accountability, but it's not the end. This is about more than one judge. It's about a system that allowed this to happen. We're committed to pushing for reforms that ensure no one else has to go through what so many have experienced in Judge Reynolds' courtroom. When asked about James's case, Sarah replied, "We will file a motion to have Mr. Carter's case reopened under a new judge. The evidence in his favor is undeniable, and now, with a fair trial, justice will prevail." James, though less comfortable in the spotlight, spoke briefly. "This isn't just a victory for me," he said. "It's for everyone who's been wronged. It's a reminder that no one is above accountability, not even a judge." Their words struck a chord, and the crowd erupted into applause. James and Sarah stepped away from the reporters, walking toward the quieter edge of the crowd. James finally exhaled, the weight of months of stress beginning to lift. "You did it," he said, looking at Sarah. "We did it," she corrected, a faint smile breaking through her professional demeanor. Meanwhile, Reynolds was being escorted out of the back entrance of the courthouse, shielded from the crowds by security. His car waited at the curb, but the short walk to it felt like an eternity. The cameras weren't there, but the few courthouse employees who passed him offered no sympathy, only cold, judgmental stares. As he settled into the back seat, Reynolds leaned his head against the window, staring blankly at the passing streets. His attorney sat beside him, silent, the tension between them thick. The humiliation of being publicly removed from the bench was unbearable, but the looming criminal investigation was even worse. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt completely powerless. The fallout from the decision was swift. News outlets ran breaking headlines within minutes. Judge removed for bias after public hearing, and judicial reform on the horizon as Reynolds faces criminal inquiry. Social media exploded with reactions, many celebrating the decision as a win for accountability. Advocacy groups used the momentum to push for broader reforms, including more oversight of the judiciary and greater transparency in the courtroom. At Sarah's office, a small celebration was underway. Her team had worked tirelessly to compile the evidence and support the movement that had grown out of James's case. Now, they were finally seeing the results of their efforts. Sarah sat at her desk, a glass of sparkling water in hand, as she watched the coverage on her phone. James sat across from her, his own relief evident but subdued. "Do you think this will really change anything?" he asked. Sarah set her glass down, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said. "Reynolds is just one judge, but his removal sends a message. It shows that the system can be held accountable. Now we need to make sure this momentum doesn't fade." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had never expected his fight for fairness in a simple property case to turn into a movement. Yet here they were, at the center of something much larger than either of them had anticipated. That evening, as Reynolds sat alone in his study, the gravity of his situation fully sank in. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, former colleagues, and even his family. But he ignored them all. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly as he stared at the stack of legal documents in front of him. They were no longer a shield. They were evidence, pieces of a career that had unraveled in spectacular fashion. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah closed her office for the night. She packed up her files, her mind already racing with plans for the next steps. James's case would be reopened, and she intended to see it through to the very end. For her, this wasn't just about one victory. It was about building a better system, one case at a time. As she locked the door and walked into the quiet evening, the faint echoes of the day's triumph lingered in her mind. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. The days following Judge Reynolds' removal from the bench were chaotic, both for him and for the judicial system he had once dominated. The state attorney general's office announced an official inquiry into his conduct, focusing not only on the Carter case, but on a long list of rulings that had raised red flags. Prosecutors began combing through court transcripts and financial records, searching for evidence of deeper corruption. The media pounced on every update, keeping Reynolds' name plastered across headlines and broadcasts. For Reynolds, the fallout was swift and devastating. His removal had turned him into a pariah in the legal community. Former colleagues distanced themselves, and organizations he had been affiliated with quietly erased his name from their rosters. Even his longtime friends stopped returning his calls. He was no longer a respected figure in the judiciary. He was a cautionary tale. Sitting in his dimly lit study, Reynolds felt the crushing weight of isolation. The once proud judge now faced the grim reality of public disgrace and potential criminal charges. The emails from his attorney were increasingly grim, outlining the growing list of accusations against him. Among them were allegations of financial conflicts of interest, cases where his rulings seemed to favor parties with whom he had undisclosed connections. Reynolds had always thought he was untouchable, but now it was clear that his arrogance had been his undoing. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell's office became the epicenter of a broader movement for judicial reform. Advocacy groups reached out, eager to collaborate on campaigns aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in the judiciary. Sarah, though focused on James Carter's reopened case, saw the opportunity to push for systemic change. The motion to reopen James's case was quickly accepted by the courts, and it was reassigned to a new judge. Sarah wasted no time preparing, determined to give James the fair hearing he had been denied. Unlike the first trial, this one was straightforward. With Judge Reynolds out of the picture, the evidence spoke for itself. The new judge ruled in James's favor within days, restoring his rightful ownership of the disputed property. James sat quietly in the courtroom as the judge announced the decision, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her own satisfaction evident. "You deserve this," she said simply. "This is what justice looks like." As they left the courthouse, a small crowd of reporters and supporters gathered outside. Unlike the previous media frenzy, this moment felt quieter, more personal. James stopped briefly to speak to the reporters, his words measured but heartfelt. "This wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about standing up to a system that too often fails people like me. Today we took a step toward making things right, and I hope this inspires others to keep fighting." Sarah followed with her own statement, addressing the larger implications of James's victory. This case wasn't just about one property dispute. It exposed the cracks in our judicial system and showed us what happens when we allow unchecked power to go unchallenged. But this isn't the end. We still have work to do to ensure accountability at every level. The reporters listened intently, their cameras capturing the moment as Sarah and James walked away, finally able to breathe after months of stress and uncertainty. Across town, Reynolds watched the coverage from his living room, his face ashen. The sight of James standing in front of the courthouse, victorious, was a bitter pill to swallow. For years, he had wielded power without question, dismissing cases and people without a second thought. Now, the man he had tried to silence was a symbol of resilience and justice. Reynolds' disgrace was complete. As the inquiry into his conduct continued, more damning evidence came to light. Investigators uncovered emails suggesting that Reynolds had received favors from certain law firms and corporate entities whose cases he had presided over. Though no explicit bribes were found, the circumstantial evidence painted a damning picture of unethical behavior. Reynolds' attorney warned him that criminal charges were now a very real possibility. The once proud judge found himself spiraling further into despair. His finances were in ruins, his legal fees mounting by the day. Public opinion had turned against him entirely, with protests forming outside his gated home. The calls for broader judicial reform had grown louder, fueled by the momentum of Reynolds' downfall. For Sarah, the victory in James's case marked the beginning of a new chapter. She had become a leading voice in the push for judicial accountability, using her platform to advocate for policy changes. She worked tirelessly with advocacy groups, lobbying for measures like mandatory bias training for judges, greater transparency in judicial appointments, and public access to court records. James, though less visible in the movement, continued to support Sarah's efforts. He attended community events and spoke to others who had experienced injustice in the courtroom, offering his story as proof that change was possible. One evening, Sarah received an unexpected email. It was from the State Attorney General's office, informing her that Reynolds would face criminal charges for misconduct and ethical violations. The message was brief, but clear. The case against him was strong, and they intended to make an example of him. Sarah read the email twice, letting the words sink in. Reynolds' fall from grace had been monumental, but she knew it wasn't about retribution. It was about accountability. His removal had opened the door for systemic change, but the real work was just beginning. Later that night, she met with James to share the news. They sat in her office, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. "They're charging him," Sarah said simply. "It's official." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" "It already has," Sarah replied. "But this is just one step. We have to keep going." As the weeks passed, the reforms Sarah and others had fought for began to take shape. The state judiciary announced new oversight measures, including regular performance reviews for judges and public reporting of complaints. Advocacy groups used Reynolds' case as a rallying point, demanding similar changes in other states. For Sarah and James, the journey had been exhausting, but it was worth it. They had stood up to a broken system and forced it to confront its flaws. And while the road ahead was still long, they knew they had made an impact that would be felt for years to come. The public trial of Judge Thomas Reynolds became one of the most widely followed legal proceedings in the state's history. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, activists, and citizens who had been personally affected by his rulings crowding the gallery. The trial's coverage extended beyond local news. National outlets picked it up as a defining moment in the fight for judicial accountability. The evidence presented by prosecutors was staggering. Financial records showed Reynolds had attended private events hosted by wealthy litigants whose cases he presided over. While no explicit bribes were traced, there were enough favors, gifts, and questionable decisions to paint a damning picture. Testimonies from attorneys and former litigants revealed a pattern of Reynolds dismissing cases with merit, silencing opposing counsel, and favoring powerful parties. One witness, a small business owner named Marco, described how Reynolds had ruled against him in a lawsuit involving a multinational corporation. "I had evidence, contracts, emails, everything to prove my case," Marco testified, his voice filled with frustration. "But Judge Reynolds didn't even let me present half of it. He sided with them before we even finished." The prosecution tied Marco's case to emails uncovered in the investigation, showing Reynolds had attended a golf tournament funded by the corporation's executives just weeks before the ruling. It wasn't just unethical, it was a blatant conflict of interest. Reynolds' defense team scrambled to counter the narrative, arguing there was no direct evidence of bribery or personal gain. But the weight of the testimony and the circumstantial evidence made their arguments sound hollow. Reynolds himself took the stand, his demeanor far removed from the authoritative judge he had once been. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice faltering. "But I've always acted within the law. Any suggestion that I intentionally favored one side over another is simply not true." The prosecutor didn't let him off easily. "Judge Reynolds, if you've always acted within the law, can you explain why so many of your rulings disproportionately benefited powerful entities over individual plaintiffs? Was it coincidence or bias?" Reynolds hesitated, visibly struggling to answer. I relied on the facts presented," he said weakly, but the damage was already done. His inability to justify the pattern in his rulings was clear to everyone in the room. The trial dragged on for weeks, but by the end, there was little doubt about the outcome. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty on multiple counts of judicial misconduct, breach of ethics, and obstruction of justice. While he avoided a conviction for outright bribery, the charges were severe enough to ensure his career and his reputation were irreparably destroyed. As the judge read out the sentence, Reynolds sat motionless, his face pale. He was disbarred, fined a significant sum, and sentenced to several years of probation, with the possibility of incarceration should new evidence arise. While it wasn't the harshest punishment imaginable, It was enough to ensure he would never wield power in the courtroom again. The gallery erupted into applause when the sentence was announced, but Reynolds didn't look up. He shuffled out of the courtroom, flanked by his attorney and security, his once imposing figure reduced to a shadow of itself. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Sarah and James stood among the crowd of supporters. People waved signs calling for more reforms, chanting slogans about fairness and accountability. Reporters swarmed Sarah as she stepped up to speak, her voice calm but resolute. "Today, we've seen what happens when the system is forced to confront its own failings," she began. This trial was about more than one judge. It was about ensuring that power doesn't go unchecked, that fairness isn't just a promise, but a reality. Judge Reynolds' removal and conviction are steps in the right direction, but they are only steps. The work to reform the judiciary and protect the rights of every individual is far from over. James stood beside her, his presence quiet but powerful. When a reporter asked him how he felt about the verdict, he paused before answering. "It's not just about justice for me. It's about the people who came forward, the people who spoke out when they thought no one would listen. This wasn't just my fight, it was ours." The crowd cheered, and Sarah and James stepped back, letting the movement take center stage. For James, the journey had been personal, but seeing the larger impact gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't expected. For Sarah, it was a validation of her relentless efforts, proof that change was possible when people stood together. As the weeks passed, the reforms sparked by Reynolds' case began to take shape. New measures were introduced to ensure greater oversight of judges, including mandatory disclosures of financial relationships, regular performance reviews, and expanded public access to court transcripts. The state also implemented mandatory training programs on bias and ethics for all judicial officials, a direct result of the advocacy efforts led by Sarah and others. James, though less visible in the public eye, continued to play a role in the movement. He spoke at community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. His victory in his reopened case had not only restored his family's property, but had also become a symbol of what could be achieved through persistence and unity. For Reynolds, the consequences were far-reaching. Stripped of his authority, his name became synonymous with corruption and failure. His disbarment left him unable to practice law, and the financial penalties drained what remained of his savings. He retreated into obscurity, his once prominent career reduced to a cautionary tale of arrogance and abuse of power. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team pressed forward, using the momentum from Reynolds' trial to push for national reforms. They worked with advocacy groups, legislators, and even other attorneys to draft proposals that would make the judiciary more transparent and accountable. Sarah's determination never wavered, and her influence grew as she became a trusted voice in the fight for systemic change. One evening, months after the trial, Sarah and James met for coffee at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. The conversation was lighter than usual, reflecting the relief that came with seeing their efforts bear fruit. "You've come a long way," Sarah said, smiling at James. "From sitting in that courtroom to standing in front of crowds, inspiring people." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this. I just wanted my property back." Sarah leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it starts small, one case, one voice, but when people stand up, it grows into something bigger. That's what this was always about, something bigger." They clinked their coffee mugs in a quiet toast, both understanding that while the fight was far from over, they had made a lasting impact. Their actions had set a precedent, one that would ripple through the judiciary for years to come. Months turned into a year, and the echoes of Judge Reynolds' downfall continued to reverberate throughout the legal system. His case became a defining moment in judicial reform, referenced in law schools, advocacy campaigns, and legislative hearings. The reforms Sarah Mitchell and her team had fought for became law, ensuring stricter oversight and transparency for judges across the state. The ripples of their work reached beyond state lines, inspiring similar movements in other parts of the country. For Sarah, the experience was transformative. She had always been a fighter for justice, but this case had shown her the power of collective action. Her once modest practice had grown into a hub for reform, where attorneys, activists, and everyday citizens came together to challenge systemic issues. Sarah became a sought-after speaker at conferences and events, her name synonymous with integrity and perseverance. James Carter, meanwhile, had returned to a quieter life. His family's property was thriving again, a reminder of what fairness and determination could achieve. But he hadn't entirely stepped away from the movement. He remained a voice of encouragement, attending community forums and offering support to those who, like him, had felt silenced by the system. Though he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, his story continued to inspire others to stand up for what was right. On a crisp autumn day, James found himself back at the courthouse, this time as a guest speaker at a seminar on judicial accountability. He spoke about his experience with humility and grace, emphasizing the importance of persistence and community. As he finished, the audience erupted into applause, many thanking him personally for sharing his story. Afterward, Sarah joined him outside the courthouse steps, the same steps where they had stood a year earlier, surrounded by reporters and supporters. The atmosphere was calmer now, but the significance of their journey wasn't lost on either of them. "You did well in there," Sarah said, smiling. "You've become quite the speaker." James laughed. "I had a good teacher." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courthouse. For all the battles they had fought, the victories they had won, and the reforms they had pushed, they both knew there was more to do. But for now, they allowed themselves a rare moment of peace. "Do you ever think about him?" James asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Reynolds?" Sarah replied. "Sometimes. Not often. He's not the point anymore. What matters is the change we made because of him. He's just a chapter in a much bigger story." James nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "A lot of people won't forget what he did," he said, "but maybe now they'll remember what came after." Sarah smiled, her gaze steady. "That's the goal." As they walked away from the courthouse, their steps light but purposeful, it was clear that their work wasn't done. But it was also clear that they had already made a difference, one that would continue to grow long after their names faded from the headlines. For Sarah and James, the fight for justice was never about recognition or revenge. It was about fairness, dignity, and the belief that no one, not even the most powerful, was above accountability. And as they moved forward, they carried that belief with them, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.